Okay, we're going to read The Monkey's Paw. As I'm reading, I want you to follow along and annotate. That means you are actively listening, using a pen or a pencil to take notes. I want you to look at what the text says, make some connections, and create inferences from that. So let's start with that. Paragraph number 1. Without, the night was cold and wet, but in small parlor of Laburnum Villa, the blinds were drawn and the fire burned brightly. Father and son were at chess, the former, who possessed ideas about the game involving radical changes, putting his king into such sharp and unnecessary perils that it provoked comment from the white-haired old lady knitting placidly by the fire. So I highlighted the word provoked because that's one of our vocab words. So it stirred up or brought about comments from the white-haired old lady. So the white-haired old lady I underlined, and I started wondering, well, who is that? That's the question that I'm asking myself. Is that a mom, a neighbor, a grandma? Who is that? Okay. And then paragraph 2, hark! At the wind said Mr. White. So I'm going to infer, well, who is Mr. White? Maybe he's the father who, having seen a fatal mistake after it was too late, was amiably desirous of preventing his son from seeing it. So I can infer that the fatal mistake had to do with their chess game, that maybe he really messed up on his moves. And then by preventing his son from seeing it, the mistake must have been so obvious that he couldn't hide it. So again, we're just making some general observations at this point. I'm listening, said the latter. So who was the latter? Who was the latter person to speak was the son, because initially it says something about the father. It says Mr. White was. In paragraph 1, it says that he was the former. So now down here it's referencing the son being the latter. Grimly surveying the board as he stretched out his hand. Check. I should hardly think he'd come tonight, said his father, with his hand poised over the board. Mate, replied the son. Turn your page. Never mind, dear, said the wife soothingly. Perhaps you will win the next one. So the inference is the white-haired woman is the wife. Mr. White looked up sharply just in time to intercept a knowing glance between mother and son. The words died away on his lips, and he hid a guilty grin in his gray beard. There he is, said Herbert White. So maybe Herbert White is the son, as the gate banged too loudly and heavy footsteps came toward the door. So there's someone at the door right now. Paragraph 10. The old man rose with hospitable haste. Opening the door, was heard condoling with the new arrival. The new arrival also condoled with himself, so that Mrs. White said, "Tut, tut," and coughed gently as her husband entered the room, followed by a tall, burly man, beady of eye and rubicund of visage. So that means he has a red face. And so how did I figure that out? I looked down at the vocab at the bottom. Sergeant Major Morris, he said, introducing himself. The sergeant major shook hands and, taking the proffered seat by the fire, watched contentedly while his host got out whiskey and tumblers and stood a small copper kettle on the fire. So the host, being the husband and the wife and kind of the son as well, are preparing for their guest, and the guest is sitting respectfully waiting. So at the third glass, by the way, well, what is the third glass of? Maybe the whiskey that's in the tumbler. At the third glass, his eyes got brighter, so he's feeling energized now, and he began to talk. He's relaxing. The little family circle regarding with eager interest this visitor from the distant parts as he squared his broad shoulders in the chair and spoke of strange scenes and doughty deeds, of wars and plagues and strange people. 21 years of it, said Mr. White, nodding at his wife and son. When he went away, he was a slip, so that means a young, of youth in the warehouse. Now look at him. Turn the page. He doesn't look to have taken much harm, said Mrs. White politely. I'd like to go to India myself, said the old man, just to look around a bit, you know. Better where you are, said the sergeant mayor, shaking his head. He put down the empty glass and, sighing softly, shook it again. I should like to see those old temples and fakirs and jugglers, said the old man. What was that you started telling me the other day about a monkey's paw or something, Morris? Nothing, said the soldier hastily. Leastways, nothing worth hearing. Paragraph 20. Monkey's paw, said Mrs. White curiously. Well, it's just a bit of what you might call magic, perhaps, said the sergeant major offhandedly. His three listeners leaned forward eagerly. The visitor absent-mindedly put his empty glass to his lips and then set it down again. His host filled it for him. To look at, said Sergeant Major, fumbling in his pocket, it's just an ordinary little paw dried to a mummy. So when it says to look at, right there you can make the inference that they're saying, yeah, that's what you see, but there probably is something more to it. He took something out of his pocket and offered it. Mrs. White drew back with a grimace. Why did she have a grimace? What was wrong with that? But her son, taking it, examined it curiously. And what is there special about it? Inquired Mr. White, as he took it from his son and, having examined it, placed it upon the table. It had a spell put on it by an old fakir. I don't know if I'm saying that right. Said the sergeant major, a very holy man. He wanted to show that fate, so number 20, fate is destiny down there at the bottom, ruled people's lives, and that those who interfered with it did so to their sorrow. So there's a little bit of a warning in there. So anyone who messed with their fate kind of had a consequence from that. He put a spell on it so that 3 separate men could each have 3 wishes from it. His manner was so impressive that his hearers, by the way, his hearers were the mother, the father, and the son, were conscious that their light laughter jarred somewhat. Well, why don't you have 3, sir? Said Herbert White cleverly. So you can infer that he hasn't made 3 wishes, and there must be a reason.